It's great to see you all. We've got a packed house. It's amazing. It is my incredible pleasure to welcome Cory Doctorow today to talk. Cory is a very famous and influential author who has written, in addition to the book that we're going to talk about today, The Internet Con: How to Seize the Means of Computation, has also written a number of different novels as well as other policy books. Including Choke Point Capitalism, how big tech and big content captured creative labor markets and how we'll win them back. Cory also regularly contributes to advocacy as part of his work with the Electronic Frontier Foundation and other organizations. And Cory, you can jump in and correct me if I get any of this wrong or if I missed anything. But also someone that I have admired his work in the policy space for a long time. And so when I found out that he was going to be speaking this evening, and I encourage everyone to join Cory this evening at the Boston Public Library's Central Library in Copley Square at 6 o'clock for an event titled The Right to Read: Ensuring Access to Books for Everyone, Everywhere. This event features Cory and another excellent author, Leah Johnson and Kelly Brodsman, who's the executive director of the Prison Book Program in Quincy. And so I encourage everyone to join us later at 6. But when I saw that he was speaking here, I reached out, sent an email. Cory and I had met each other at DEF CON, which is an incredible security conference, hackers conference in Las Vegas years ago. And he wrote back immediately and said he would love to join. So one of the things that we're going to talk about today, in the interest of cutting straight to the conversation, because we're going to jump straight to Q&A, is issues around a lot of the floating topics around big technology, competition, intellectual property, and privacy, among other things. And so to get us started, Cory, thank you for being here, and welcome to BU Law. Could you summarize just a little for us the main argument that you make in the Internet Con: How to Seize the Means of Computation?
Yeah, sure. And thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. It's nice to be here in the city. So nice they named it twice, the Windy City, Boston, Massachusetts. The argument that I'm making is that the failure of technology, the transformation of the internet into what Tom Eastman calls 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4, was the result of some specific policy choices, and that those policy choices had the net effect of removing what an economist might call discipline from tech firms. That whatever impulses the people who run them might have in the moment, either because they're greedy or because they're scared or because they're being pressurized by their investors or what have you, those are historically checked by disciplining forces, right? Like competition, right? The fear that your customer might go somewhere else, or regulation, the fear that the way that the compromise you make cashes out will actually be a net loss because the regulator will smack you around so hard for whatever you've done that it'll eat up all the gains you've gotten from cheating. Or in tech, there are some really specific forms of discipline, right? So the one is the focus of this book, interoperability. So broadly speaking, we only know how to make one kind of computer. It's what computer scientists call the Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine. It's a computer that can run every program. We don't know how to make the computer that runs most programs, but not the ones we don't like. If we could, then we wouldn't have viruses, right? We just make computers that ran good programs and not bad ones. And so because computers can run any program, it means that if a vendor or firm does something to their products that make them worse, right? Like they make them privacy invasive, or they do something like we see now with software as a service, where they monitor your usage of the software and identify across their customer base which feature is most valued, and then take it out of the basic tier and make it an upcharge, that you would expect that someone else could enter this market and say, okay, well, here's an interoperable program that allows you to use third-party ink in your printer, or allows you to unlock that feature that was just locked up. Or, you know, as we see with browsers, more than 50% of all internet users have installed an ad blocker, which is also a privacy blocker. So Congress hasn't moved on privacy since 1988, right? Our last consumer privacy law in this country is the Video Privacy Protection Act, which bans video store clerks from telling newspapers which VHS cassettes you took home. It's like a law that literally regulates 2 things that don't exist and 1 thing that almost doesn't exist. Clearly not the last privacy threat we've had. And so historically, that was a great disciplining force because, if you're having like a product meeting and someone says, all right, gang, our KPI, our key performance indicator here is like top line ad revenue. I've done some back of the napkin math. I think if we make the ads 20% more obnoxious, we're going to bring in 2% more gross ad revenue. We all get to take a vacation in Switzerland, go skiing this Christmas. Wouldn't that be great? Someone sticks their hand up and says, Elon, I love how you think, but has it occurred to you that if we make the ads 20% more invasive, 40% of our users will go to a search engine and type, how do I stop seeing ads? And when they do that, the revenue doesn't stay status quo ante, right? It's not 100%. Certainly doesn't rise to the 102%. It drops to 0 forever because nobody ever goes back to the search engine and says, how can I start seeing ads again, right? The minute the Tesla owner goes to the dealership or the independent mechanic and says, yeah, to use my whole battery, I have to pay a subscription to Tesla. Can you just jailbreak my car so that I can use my whole battery without paying a subscription to Tesla? That person never goes back to the dealer for service again, right? Tesla loses their connection to that customer forever. So this creates a kind of equilibrium in which firms are disciplined by the fear that an interoperator will eat their lunch if they make their product bad. And no one loses money betting on the hubris of tech leaders. So when they come out on the wrong side of that bet, right, when they do make things worse, you do get to self-help, right? So that was the third force that acted as a check on tech firms that disciplined them. And then the fourth force that disciplined firms historically was their own workforce, because they have this uniquely constituted workforce, or did, in that they had a durable power born of scarcity. So it's often the case that in labor markets, there's short-lived scarcity, right? There's just not enough people to do a thing that's a new skill, but people rush in and they fill that job. They go and they retrain. But with tech, the appetite grew faster than we could train people for a long time. And so tech workers had this bargaining power. Now, their bosses figured out that they could get around that bargaining power by appealing to their sense of mission. The librarian Fobazi Ettar calls this vocational awe. Like help us connect the world or help us organize the world's information and make it useful. Elon Musk calls it being extremely hardcore. You sleep under your desk, you miss your mother's funeral. And this works great for tech bosses. All they had to do is pay these workers with stock options, which unlike money, you just make yourself by typing zeros into a spreadsheet. And so long as the companies kept growing, the workers would accept them and show up for work every hour that God sent to ship to your crazy arbitrary deadlines. And so this was great for tech firms. The downside for tech firms was that people who believe in their sense of mission don't want to violate it. And so when you say make the ads 20% more obnoxious, the people involved say, I'm experiencing a profound moral injury here, and I'm going to make sure you feel it too. And they say, no, because you can't fire me. And so what we've seen over the last 20 years is the erosion of these disciplining forces. I don't think the people involved got worse. I think they were probably, like in many cases, pretty terrible to begin with. That they went to work every morning and there was a giant lever behind the CEO's desk labeled enshittification, and they yanked it as hard as they could, but it didn't move because it was gummed up by competition, by regulation, by the fear of self-help, by their own workforce. And that as these things eroded, first because we eliminated competition enforcement, right? We had a 40-year coma for antitrust law in this country that only stopped about 4 years ago with the Biden administration. That led to regulatory capture. That regulatory capture could not just be used to ignore regulation, but also to mobilize regulation against new market entrants, to use IP law to stop people from making interoperable products by claiming they were circumventions, that they violated your patents, that they were computer fraud and abuse violations, that you were a tortfeasor doing tortious interference with contract, that you were violating copyright, that you were violating trademark. Apple engraves microscopic Apple logos on the subcomponents in your iPhone so that if it gets shipped overseas to be broken up for parts, when it comes back, they say that it's a trademark violation to re-import it because no one knows what state those components are, and so there's a tarnishment possibility, and they have CBP seize boxes of iPhone components and destroy them as counterfeits, even though they were manufactured by Apple, and that lets Apple stop you from getting your iPhone fixed at a third-party Depot, which means that you have to take it to them, and then they say, I'm sorry, it's beyond repair, you'll have to get a new one. Not coincidentally, Tim Cook told his investors in 2019 with his first investor letter of the year, the biggest threat to Apple's profits is people using their devices instead of upgrading them, right? And so, we see the metastasis of IP, right? What Jay Freeman calls felony contempt of business model, right? You mobilizing the state against your new market entrant rivals to shut them down because what they do interferes with your profitability, not because it violates like the black letter of any law ever passed. And then finally, we now see 260,000 tech layoffs in 2023, 100,000 in the first half of 2024, and the complete routing of tech worker power. And so this is a book about one of those things. It's about interoperability and about the path to restoring interoperability as one of the ways that we can discipline tech firms and take these flawed vessels who yank on the enshittification lever every day and make that lever not move as much. And that will open up a policy space for us doing other stuff with labor, with regulation, with antitrust.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of questions I think that spill out naturally from that, but you mentioned enshittification a few times. So I'd like to unpack that a little first before we dig in any further. So in 2022, you coined the term enshittification for the pattern in which online products and services decline in quality, or I guess more bluntly, how platforms die. This concept, if you're not familiar with it, has really resonated with people, so much so that the American Dialect Society selected it as its 2023 word of the year. Can you tell us what enshittification is and why it's important?
So I've laid out the enshittification hypothesis there for you. It's the way to think about enshittification. And I think I've been talking about this for a long time, but people like cussing. And so when you give them a dirty word they can cite in their academic articles, they're just delighted. NPR hosts just love like the idea that they're going to get bleeped, and it makes them feel edgy. From the outside, enshittification has a kind of characteristic three-stage process, right? First, you have a firm that's quite good to its end users. So, Amazon gives you a square deal, right? And then you have a user that is worse to its end users to be better to its merchants. So like Facebook originally, when they opened up to the general public, they said, leave MySpace, come to Facebook. We're like MySpace, but we'll never spy on you. That was their pitch in 2006. And then they told their advertisers and publishers, actually, we'll spy on these people. And also, we'll put things in their feed that they never asked to see. So advertisers, we can target them with incredible fidelity for small amounts of money. And we have a huge building full of engineers that do nothing but look for ad fraud. And publishers will create a free funnel of traffic to your website. You just put short excerpts on the website with a link to your own website, and we'll non-consensually cram it into the eyeballs of people who never asked to see it and who we promised we would only show the things that they asked to see. And so that makes Facebook worse for end users, better for their business customers, and everybody gets locked in. End users lock each other in. You're on Facebook because your friends are there. Your friends are on Facebook because you're there. You love your friends, but they're a giant pain in the ass, and you can't get them all to agree that it's time to leave, and so you're all stuck, right? Advertisers and publishers, meanwhile, are stuck there because they need to reach you. And so everyone's stuck to Facebook. So Facebook starts to titer down the value that's left behind in the platform, trying to reach a kind of quantum of value that is the minimum required to keep you there, and to keep the publishers and advertisers they make money from locked in because you're there as well. And so, one of the things about blocking interoperability is it's a powerful form of lock-in, right? It's a powerful way to keep people on the platform, which increases the amount of abuse you can dole out to everyone, not because you're sadistic, but because the worse things are for other people, the better you can make them for yourself. The more privacy invasive conduct your users have to endure, the better things are for you. If you're an advertising supported business, the less you police ad fraud, the less money you have to spend on it, the more your advertisers have to bear the cost of ad fraud instead of you. And so Facebook today doesn't bother to police ad fraud, and it's with the kind of muscularity that it used to approach the subject with. And you have these bizarre situations where Procter & Gamble had a $100 million a year programmatic advertising budget. Programmatic advertising is the industry euphemism for surveillance advertising. And they reduced that budget to zero, and they saw a 0% drop in sales. Because to a first approximation, no one saw the ads. It was just getting stolen by the ad tech industry and stolen by thieves in the ad tech industry that the ad tech industry couldn't be bothered to shut down, right? And so then you get this like final, very brittle situation where the platform has tried to reduce the amount of value, residual value, to just enough to keep you there. But that's not a static number, right? There are exogenous factors that can make you decide that what used to make it worthwhile is not worthwhile anymore. So you get like a live stream mass shooting, or a Cambridge Analytica scandal, or a whistleblower, or any one of a number of these shocks, and then people bolt for the exits. Stock analysts go crazy. So Facebook, when they announced that their growth wasn't as robust as they expected, not even a loss of users, right? A downturn in growth on the main platform. They lost $250 billion in a one-day sell-off. It was the largest sell-off in corporate history until last week with NVIDIA, which you love to see. But this prompts these horrific panics on the part of these companies. And the Silicon Valley term for panicking is pivoting. And so this is how Facebook, went through this weird period where Mark Zuckerberg woke up one day and said, "I've had a revelation. I know for a decade I've told you that from now on your future is arguing with your racist Facebook uncle in the primitive text interface that I developed so that me and my fellow Harvard undergrads could non-consensually rate the fuckability of our fellow undergraduates. However, from now on your future is going to be a legless, sexless, low polygon, heavily surveilled cartoon character in a virtual world I stole from a 25-year-old dystopian science fiction novel called The Metaverse," right? And we see this as kind of the terminal stage of enshittification. But enshittification, I want to point out, that's the external signs of it, right? The underlying thing that's happening, because these firms could have done this before. The reason they're doing it now is because of the collapse of discipline, right? It's not like these people do not have the executive function to lay in wait for 20 years, just waiting to spring the trap and screw you over with the plan that they've had since they were 20 years old. They've been trying to execute that plan every day, except they keep getting foiled, and they're not getting foiled anymore because of the collapse of constraint. And so they're just pushing on a door that's swinging, whereas it used to stop. And so that's the other side of enshittification, what's going on under the hood.
So I've got so many questions about that. But one of them is, in the book here, you talk about how dominant firms abusing their position of dominance is not unique to tech companies, but how much of enshittification and what we're seeing now is in fact unique to tech, and why? Or is this a sort of broader problem and technology is just the most recent version of it?
Yeah, so it's a complex story. So I think that if we think back to the four forces that discipline firms, two of them are universal: competition and regulation. But tech's uniquely constituted workforce was not the workforce of, say, the grocery sector, right? Grocery sector was not held in check by ardent, produce specialists who really didn't want to see the product go downhill. Even if they felt that way, they didn't have the bargaining power to push back. Nor is interoperability a universal feature that can be exploited in other sectors for, to do an end run around regulatory failures, for example. So tech has got these two distinctive characteristics, the workforce and interoperability. And so other sectors are getting worse because they're not disciplined by regulation, they're not disciplined by competition, but the panoply of tricks they can play is much smaller. So there's a core mechanism in enshittification I call twiddling, which is just changing the business logic really quickly so that end users and business customers can't figure out if they're getting ripped off, right? It's just a shell game. And if you've ever seen like Penn and Teller do the cup and balls with transparent cups in slow motion, it's a great, look it up, it's on YouTube, it's really cool. And it's not a sophisticated trick, it's just done quickly. And when it's done quickly, it baffles you. But when it's done slowly, it's very easy to spot. And a lot of the tricks that the hard goods sector has to do, they just can't do them with the fast hands that you get from a computer. So Veena Dubel's a legal scholar who has coined this term algorithmic wage discrimination. You're not Veena? No. Oh, she was here. Okay, I was just about to have a Woody Allen, you know nothing of my work moment here. So I'm a great admirer of her work, but I've never met her. So she talks about algorithmic wage discrimination. If you drive Uber, every ride that you get, the wage is based on how selective you've been recently. So if you've been more selective, they offer you a higher wage. If you're less selective, they monotonically lower that wage. If you are too selective, they knock you off the platform. So you're playing chicken with the algorithm, even if you know that this is going on. But a lot of people don't. And so what they're trying to do is get you down to a wage where whatever side hustles that you used to do that allowed you to be more selective about your wage are eliminated, and then you're stuck accepting this low wage. Presumably you've got some big capital expenses like a car as well. And if you get into an Uber these days, there's increasing amounts of infrastructure that Uber drivers are now investing in, tablets that go on seat backs and so on. All of this is just lock-in for the Uber driver. And you know, like, if you know like Tennessee Ernie Ford, you know, he sang these songs about like 19th century evil coal barons. Like, I'm sure these guys would have loved to have done this to coal miners in the Black Hills, right? But like, they just couldn't fill a boiler room with enough guys in green eye shades to change everyone's wages 13 times a second, right? It was just like not within the realm of things they could do because they had a technical limitation on their conduct. So one thing that's happening is tech is eating the world. This is Mark Andreessen's, you know, software is eating the world. Software is also enshittifying the world. It's at both ends of the alimentary canal. And as firms become more technical or more digital in their hard goods businesses. So for example, groceries are rolling out e-ink grocery store shelf tags. And so like, if you walk into the grocery store and they adjudge you to be a kind of spendy looking person, they can't reprice all the goods, right? Like they need an army of teenagers on rollerblades with pricing guns, right? But like in Norway, where these tags are now really common, they're repricing goods in grocery stores up to 2,000 times a day. Right? And so you know, William Gibson said cyberspace is everting. Like, we are seeing the digitization of more and more sectors, and they're able to avail themselves of twiddling in larger and larger fields. And so we are seeing this enshittificatory trend in other sectors, partly because they're not worried about competition and regulation, but also because they are taking on board these digital tooling that allows them to cheat at high speed, to play the shell game with computer hands.
So thinking about all of this gets overwhelming a lot. So I teach information privacy law here. I teach digital civil liberties, and we talk a lot about tech regulation with a lot of my colleagues here at BU. And it feels like there's a lot of moving parts here. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which I know you think about a little bit in your work, is what the order of operations is for cutting big tech down to size. Because we've got, just within the regulatory sphere, if that's supposed to come first, we've got intellectual property, we've got data portability and sort of interop generally, we've got privacy and all of these sort of moving parts there. But then it becomes overwhelming to think about, you know, which pieces should go first and how do we get the momentum to do that. So could you talk a little bit about sort of what's the plan here?
So on the one hand, I think that like if you accept my thesis that the four forces that used to keep tech from being terrible have collapsed, then there's an obvious remedy, which is to restore those four forces. And I don't know that it matters which one you do first. And I actually think that as you move on each one, the others get easier to do. So those four forces: competition, regulation, interoperability, and the workforce. You know, the obvious remedies are restore competition. Well, FTC has done 170 major enforcement actions in 2.5 years. Like, antitrust is back, right? We just had Google declared a monopolist. They're not alone. We're seeing more muscular antitrust over the last 4 years than in the previous 40 in Europe. In Canada, where I'm from, I'm a Canadian, we're like serial killers. We look just like everyone else and we're everywhere. In Canada, our Competition Act did not include an abuse of dominance standard, right? This is like a criminal statute that doesn't have a murder charge in it. And we finally got an abuse of dominance standard. I know it's baby steps. We're an adorable and simple people. But like, we finally have like the chance of a competition law that's fit for purpose in Canada. The UK Competition and Markets Authority is just kicking like 10 kinds of ass. The European Commission, obviously with the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act. Australia, not all the things they've done are things I agree with. I think the news bargaining code was a mistake, not because tech isn't stealing from the news, but because what tech steals from the news is money in the form of supernormal rents for payment processing and advertising, not content. I think like talking about the news on a platform is not bad for the news. If you're not allowed to talk about the news, it's not the news, it's a secret. But Australia is still like up in arms and doing the unthinkable. Japan, South Korea. One cool thing about this is that these companies don't cook up new swindles for each country they operate in. So the fact pattern that's exposed when you have a successful prosecution or regulatory intervention in one country or market study, that fact pattern is persistent across all the markets. So South Korea and Japan takes the European Union's market study on Apple, which they actually stole from the UK Competition Markets Authority Digital Markets Union because during the 10-year Brexit years, the DMU never got its enforcement powers. They had 70 engineers on a full-time public wage, but they couldn't do anything except write reports because the secondary legislation couldn't get through Parliament because they kept having to dissolve Parliament because they had the succession of chaotic, terrible prime ministers. And so they just wrote these reports that other agencies elsewhere in the world picked up. So the EU picks it up, does a successful prosecution based on it. South Korea and Japan basically just run it through probably Google Translate, and use it to go after Apple, right? And so you have all these like enforcement possibilities, transnational enforcement possibilities. You're seeing Singapore, for example, also pick this stuff up. Even in China, the cyberspace directive looks at Chinese big tech as a serious rival to the power of the Politburo and prohibits Chinese tech companies, incumbents, from taking steps that block interoperability with new market entrants. So this is all over the world. So competition's like on the march, and in general, we can just we can catch that wave. There's so much to be done, and it's a big wave, and it could knock some stuff down. So we got to make sure it goes in the right place. So there's this Google conviction for being an illegal monopolist. Now we're moving into the remedy phase. One of the things the judge found was that Google's durable source of dominance was in part its data, right? The data that it stole from us by invading our privacy through monopolistic conduct. One of the remedies that a lot of people who agree with me about other stuff seem to think is a good idea is the absolutely bonkers idea that we should make Google share that data with rivals, right? Google has amassed a bunch of extremely toxic waste. We should make them share that toxic waste with other people. This is nuts. We should make them destroy the data. And so, we have to it's not like we can just assume that competition will be a self-licking ice cream cone and just keep running on its own. We've got to be there intervening in it, making sure it goes well. Regulation, DMA and the DSA, both kind of mixed bags, but have some really cool stuff in them about interoperability. Again, we got to make sure that they come off right and not discredit the idea of interoperability. We're seeing right to repair laws at the state level that are pushing interoperability. So the Oregon right to repair bill that just passed bans this very odious practice called parts pairing. It used to be called VIN locking, came out of the car sector. So VIN is the vehicle identification number. And the way that it works is you've got the MCU, the main control computer unit of your car. It's a little computer. And then because computers are so cheap, you just put another computer in every part in the engine. And the only purpose of this part is when a new one comes in, the MCU says, if you were installed by an authorized technician, tell me the key that the authorized technician gave you when they installed you. And if the part can't, even if it's an OEM part, the engine says, I'm sorry, I won't recognize this part. So it's just a way to force you to use the dealer network for your service and put independent mechanics out of business. This is the automotive right to repair question 1 here on the 2020 ballot. Parts pairing has crept into ventilators. So during lockdown, no one could fix a Medtronic ventilator with donor parts from another Medtronic ventilator. It's the single most common ventilator in the world. Medtronic is a monopolist. They bought all their competitors, did the largest reverse merger in history, became a nominally Irish company, stopped paying taxes, and became basically the sole supplier of ventilators in the world. No one could fix a Medtronic ventilator because you had to type an unlock code, and to do that, you had to get on an airplane, and there were no airplanes. And so, hospitals couldn't keep their ventilators running. It's in John Deere tractors. When you hear farmers talk about right to repair, that's what they're talking about, because the way that it works is, you're a farmer, you fix your own stuff because you're at the end of a lonely country road, and when it's time to get the crops in, you can't wait for a technician. This is why, you find Roman farms that have a forge, right? Farmers have been fixing their stuff forever. So you fix your tractor, right? If you're a John Deere owner, you fix your tractor, and then it still doesn't work until John Deere bestirs itself to send a technician to your farm, charge you $200, and type an unlock code into your tractor's keyboard. You've done the work, right? But you pay $200 for the service call-up. So Oregon bans this. Great news. And we're also finally seeing some movement on privacy. Congress has introduced a succession of flawed but improving privacy laws over the last several sessions. There will likely be more in the next session because the coalition for privacy is growing. At EFF, we have this idea of privacy first, which is just the idea that like there's a giant potential coalition for privacy in the sense that like maybe you think that like Facebook made your grampy into a QAnon, or that Insta made your kid anorexic, or that the reason the millennials in your life are quoting Osama bin Laden is TikTok, or like you're worried that like Black Lives Matter demonstrators are having their identities enumerated by Google through reverse warrants, or that happened to the January 6 rioters, or you're worried that people of color are being discriminated against on job applications and real estate applications, mortgage applications, and so on, or like someone's making deepfake porn of you. And all of these things start with the same thing, which is that we haven't had a new privacy law since VCRs. And so that coalition is very big, and like coalitions are how stuff gets done. You asked me about my theory of change. I think that if the group currently constituted in favor of privacy could have passed a privacy law, we'd have a privacy law, right? They can't. And so they're going to need to find another group to team up with, or more than one other group. This is why politics are hard, because to get stuff done, you have to make coalitions. To get coalitions, you have to make compromises. Those compromises sometimes go beyond the pale, but they're also how you get stuff done. James Boyle at Duke Law says that before the term ecology came along, there were like 1,000 issues, but no movement, because like you care about owls, I care about the ozone layer. What does the gaseous composition of the upper atmosphere have to do with your charismatic nocturnal avians? Well, nothing until the term ecology comes along, and then we're like, oh, yeah, well, no, we are on the same side, right? This is the same fight. And so I think that we'll probably get some movement on privacy as well. In terms of labor, we are seeing the collapse of the self-mythology of tech workers that say that they're just temporarily embarrassed founders, and they're starting to view themselves as workers. More importantly, they're starting to see their destiny as being connected to the destiny of blue-collar workers within the same firm. So you have Amazon software engineers walking out with Amazon warehouse workers. You know, to quote William Gibson again, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. If you want to know what the future of tech workers looks like in the absence of the protection that scarcity got them, just look at how their bosses treat people who don't have the protection of scarcity, right? The so-called unskilled workers working in the warehouses or dropping off packages. These are people who have to pee in bottles because they don't get pee breaks. I mean, for a man with a dick-shaped rocket, Jeff Bezos has got a weird relationship to our kidneys. But, you know, these tech workers are starting to recognize that, like, the reason Andy Jassy and Jeff Bezos, you know, gave them, like, free kombucha and massages was not because they value them intrinsically. It's because they were afraid they'd quit. And now that they're not afraid they're going to quit, you know, the days of wearing black t-shirts with things your boss doesn't understand and having pink hair and a facial piercing are over, and the days of having to pee in a bottle are coming. And so that we're starting to see, you know, Tech Solidarity and Tech Workers Coalition, other trade union movements springing up around tech workers. So I think that, you know, these are the four forces that we use to push back, right? And you can see how they interrelate, how, for example, more competition law exposes firms to more labor pressure, because larger firms find it easier to resist labor pressure and easier to capture labor regulators. Too big to fail is too big to jail. Too big to jail is too big to care, right? And so making these firms, you know, afraid. Like, there's something very telling, right? Every accusation is a confession. There's something very telling about all the bosses who, in the wake of lockdown, said, you know, we have to make these workers afraid of being fired again, because that's the only way that they'll do their job. They're telling on themselves, right? Like, the only way they'll treat you good is if they're worried that you can fire them, right? Like, that's their hypothesis, right, about human action. And so, you know, we have to make them afraid that we're going to fire them as our bosses, as our suppliers, as, you know, our infrastructure. Otherwise, they've told us they don't think people should have to act good unless they're afraid of being fired. So we have to make them afraid.
Excellent. Thank you. I've got one more question, and I actually want to go to questions from the audience, because I think we're going to have many. But one of the things we haven't talked about, we've talked a lot about your policy engagement and your policy work, but one of the things we haven't talked about is the way in which a lot of that, I think, is also reflected in your novels.
Sure.
So my introduction to Cory's work was The first part of these two books, which is Little Brother, and I can't recommend it enough. It was one of the things that I read and really connected with when I was first starting as a law professor, particularly in the area of privacy, but other areas as well. Could you talk a little bit about how your fiction work influences your policy work and vice versa?
Sure. Well, like, let me start by saying that I think that, like, without being too, artsy-fartsy about this, writing novels is an art form. I consider myself a working artist. And the point of art is to, I think, take a big, numinous, irreducible feeling that is in your mind, try to move it into an intermediate third party or like external vessel, right? Choreographic dance, a book, a song, a painting, such that when the audience experiences it, some echo of what was in your mind goes into their mind. And that's kind of the point, right? That's the point of the art that I'm making, right? Now, it happens that a lot of the big irreducible numinous feelings that are in my mind involve being like incredibly angry about tech firms and worried about the state of technology. And so, of course, that comes over. It's also the case that a lot of these problems are, the reason that they get as far down the road as they do without being addressed is that there's a lot of time between the cause and the effect. Right? And this is like the most sort of pernicious problems that we have in policy spheres. It's climate change, it's smoking, it's a lot of problems, right? Where like if like smoking gave you a tumor right away, no one would have a second cigarette, right? It's because there's like you're smoking and then years later you're getting the tumor that it's very easy to kind of kid yourself. I speak as an ex-smoker. It's very easy to kid yourself that it's not as bad or you can quit later or whatever, right? Same with climate, right? Like, and the problem is that while eventually people will recognize that these are real issues that we should be dealing with seriously, the point at which that happens is for these problems beyond the point of no return. Right? If we're arguing for years over crashing rhinoceros populations, and you finally come to me and say, all right, there's just one rhinoceros left. You were right. But like, since there's only one, why don't we find out what he tastes like, right? Like denialism and nihilism are right next to each other. And so one of the things that fiction can do is move the point of peak indifference before the point of no return by making you kind of vividly imagine what it would be like to inhabit a world in which the problem has run its course and reached the point of no return, right? And I'm sometimes called a dystopian writer. I write science fiction. I don't think I'm a dystopian writer. My work has a lot of dystopian furniture in it, right? It's books in which things have gone horribly wrong. But I think that like the second law of thermodynamics is not up for debate. Things do break. Assuming nothing will break does not make you an optimist, right? Like the people who said, oh, the Titanic won't need any lifeboats were not optimists. They were like reckless people who killed people, right? And so for me, the thing that distinguishes dystopia from a hopeful book, I don't like utopia, but from a hopeful book, is not whether things go wrong or not, but whether we can set them to rights. And I'm a pulp writer. I write science fiction. It's a pulp genre. It means that we put plot forward. And it's very tempting when you're plot forward to consider the two big plots, man versus nature, and say, oh, let's get a twofer and have like man versus nature versus man. So tsunami blows your house down, your neighbors come over to eat you, right? And I think that kind of cynical plotting that just assumes that like everyone is just waiting for the chance to come over and be terrible, and that society is the only thing keeping us out of that Hobbesian state it's a cheap way to get a lot of plot into your story, but it's not a very good way. I think it primes us to have bad instincts about what's going to go wrong. And moreover, I think that like it misses out on a much better plot. And that better plot is the story of people pitching in times of crisis because they all want to help each other, but as is so often the case, not being able to agree on what should be done, right? Like it is far worse to have a rift with people you love and agree with about so many things, but who you cannot find in the final analysis work alongside of, right? Like, getting into an argument with a stranger on the subway, who gives a damn, right? Getting into an argument with, your uncle at Thanksgiving, it doesn't matter who wins, right? It's still going to be terrible for both of you and the rest of your family. And so writing stories where people who love each other and are of goodwill and express the thing that I think most of us understand, which is that in a disaster, you're not going to your neighbor's house with a shotgun, you're going to your neighbor's house with a covered dish because you've got food in the fridge and it's going to go off and you might as well have a picnic, right? That grounding the story in that, but then still having the reality that we love the people around us, but they are giant pains in the ass who won't do what we tell them to and can't see reason, makes for really good high stakes fiction. And so that's kind of the approach I take. I write when I'm anxious. So I wrote 9 books during lockdown. There's a lot of them out. There's more coming. I just signed a contract for 2 more. I'm doing an enshittification book for Farrar-Giroux, and they're doing a graphic novel at their sister imprint for Second based on it. So I write a lot, and I write picture books for Litleys and middle grades. I have a middle grades graphic novel based on my novella Radicalized coming out. I write young adult, I write adult novels, I write nonfiction, I write a newsletter every day, almost every day, called pluralistic.net that's open access. It's Creative Commons attribution only, so you can sell it, you can give it away, you can translate it, you just have to attribute it. So.
Wow. There are clearly more than one Cory Doctorow walking around. But, I couldn't have said it better, and thank you so much for that insight. We've got now about 15 more minutes. We're going to wrap up at 1:45 to give us about 15 minutes. Cory's going to be at the book signing table, the book table outside, signing if anyone wants to talk to him.
And you can just come up and talk. You don't have to buy a book.
Yeah.
It's nice if you do. I've got a kid who's going to college next year, but it's fine. You can just come and say hello.
Excellent. Yeah, please do. So, but I'd like to go to questions for the audience. So please raise your hand, and Elizabeth is going to come over with a microphone if anyone has a question.
Hi. Hello. Can you hear me? All good?
Yeah.
I was originally introduced to your work through my public library's teen book club.
Cool.
By reading Pirate Cinema.
Excellent.
It was a book that very much radicalized me as a teenager and has made me a grumpy tech curmudgeon, I guess, at this point. And eventually sort of led me into the film industry as well, is what I originally studied before coming here. And so I guess my question is, you have this sort of near future UK, London, where you have, these intense privacy laws. The protagonist is, forced to sort of flee after getting his internet shut off for downloading too many videos, that kind of thing. So that book was published, some years ago, 10 or so. And how have you sort of seen the sort of almost speculation of that premise come and now sort of either change or be maybe a little too similar to the sort of privacy laws that we're seeing now?
Piracy. Yeah. Thank you. Why don't we take 3 questions and I'll answer them all. That way we won't get we'll get a chance to hear from a couple of people. Thank you.
Hi. My question is more towards your policy work. I'm Erica George. I'm a new faculty member here, and I write on business, human rights, the environment. And I was struck by your belief in the power of the tech worker and seeing solidarity with the floor line worker. I'm reminded of the Google engineers who refused to do Dragonfly. So I wanted to invite you to comment more on that. And then also if there's a possibility to think about coalitions more broadly. So if you're supportive of the right to repair, there are implications for recycling and maybe the environment. Could we think more expansively about who needs to be in partnership in this conversation around tech and power and business?
Thank you. And is there one more, and then I'll answer them in the back there.
And I meant to say, if you could introduce yourself, that would be great. Thank you, Erica. You did that. I appreciate that. We can go.
Hi, my name's Morgan McMillan. I'm a tool here at BU Law. Originally studied music performance.
Hold the mic a little closer.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm curious on your thoughts on interoperability, the future of distributed ledgers, smart contracts, and AI regulation, and what that means for the legal profession.
Thanks. Okay, good chewy questions. So, and there is some connection there. So, the Pirate Cinema I wrote in the wake of the passage of something called the Digital Economy Act, which was a law that allowed for secondary legislation. This is the thing that we have in the UK that doesn't really happen here. I lived in London for 13 years. And the Digital Economy Act allows for secondary legislation that allows the Secretary of State to promulgate rules that disconnect households from the internet if members of that household are accused without proof of copyright infringement. And so, you know, you can imagine that the economic and social consequences of losing your internet connection have only multiplied since then. At the time, we argued that this was wildly disproportionate, leaving aside the question of, you know, proof and so on, but you know, like it being not just a badly formed law, but if it were a well-formed law, it would also be a bad law. Lockdown only made that question sharper. You know, we're currently like, that's you know, we really can't imagine living without our networks anymore. And maybe because of that, but I think more likely because of Brexit, the secondary legislation still has never appeared. Because the UK has just been in a state of total chaos for 10 years. And so I don't know where that's going to go, but I will say that, like, we entered the digital era with really like two forms of durable regulation about the internet. One was a broad prohibition, and I think a good prohibition on child sexual abuse material, which is the term of art that we now use instead of child porn, but because no one's heard of that, you then have to always call it child sexual abuse material, which everyone else calls child porn. It's one of those difficult linguistic things. And then the other one is copyright. And we really just have like takedown orders for copyright. We don't have a privacy law, we have copyright. We don't have anti-harassment laws, we have copyright. Like if someone is harassing you on Twitter, like the way to get them to stop is to figure out who owns the copyright to the memes they ganked to send you harassing stuff. Find that person to send a takedown notice, have 3 of those be sent, and then argue that under 512, you know, Section 512 of the DMCA, which provides for takedown orders, that person should be disconnected from Twitter, right? Like, this is nuts, right? It's like it's not fit for purpose in any way. And today we see an expression of that in the form of creative workers who are worried about AI. And I think there's a legitimate reason as a creative worker to be worried about AI. And it's not that I think AI can do my job. I think that it's my boss is so insatiably horny for firing me that the fact that the AI can't do my job is no barrier to my boss firing me and replacing me with AI that fails to do my job. And I think that there's a reason creative workers should be worried about this as a result. I'm a member of IATSE and the Animators Guild. I was out there with the Writers Guild. I live in Burbank, so right there, Warner, Disney, Universal. And I think that there's like a real reason to be worried, but the answer that so many creative workers have landed on is we should have the right to decide who can make a transient copy of our works, which is scraping, who can make mathematical analysis of our work, which is training, and who can embed that mathematical analysis in a published new work, which is making a model. And I think that as like a matter of copyright law, these are highly contestable as to whether they're not fair use. I think that the collateral damage, if we determine that these are not fair use, is pretty intense. Like, you can kiss all of computation linguistics goodbye for one thing, but also like the Internet Archive and search engines and a bunch of other stuff. But finally, and most importantly, give every creator in the world the right to decide who can train a model with their work. And our bosses, who are the people we're worried about putting us out of work, will tell us that as a condition of writing for them or drawing for them or making music for them, we have to sign a contract that gives them that right, that transfers the right to them. They will then train a model on our work and fire us, right? Like, what this does is changes the distribution at the margin as to whether, say, the New York Times buys a model from OpenAI, or whether OpenAI pays the New York Times to train the model on the New York Times corpus, and then the New York Times buys the model from OpenAI. And so it's how the people who want to appropriate the surplus we generate as workers split that surplus. Who makes a meal out of us does not matter to us when we get eaten. And, you know, there are other ways to approach it, but I think the copyright first approach that is the result of 25 years of like internet policy vacuum has trained us all to reach for copyright first as the all-purpose tool that solves all of our problems. There are other approaches, like one weird thing is that for the first time in my entire professional career, the United States Copyright Office keeps saying things that are good for creative workers. They keep saying AI generated works are not entitled to copyrights. Well, like, I tell you what, as much as my boss doesn't want to pay me, he really doesn't want people to be able to copy the things that he makes without paying him. And he would much rather pay me than have everything that he produces be in the public domain. And so we should be leaning really hard into this, because it leaves intact every kid who's having their D&D characters drawn by Midjourney, and attacks the people we really care about, which is the people who want to put us on the breadline, right? And so that I think is like, to answer your question, sort of where this has all gone in the last 10 years. We're still dealing with the aftermath of not having figured out copyright. The UK is its own sui generis story because it's such a mess. You asked about coalition building, right to repair, tech workers, and so on. I do think that you're right, that there are lots of opportunities for these coalitions, and we actually see them bubbling up already. So Section 12.1 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act prohibits circumvention of an access control to a copyrighted work. And so basically it means is if you have a gadget that has software inside it, a copyrighted work, and it's designed so that you can't readily change it, then changing it is against the law. Providing someone with a tool to do it is a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine. So what that means is, like, once you put some software in a thing, it's a felony to change it, right? This is a terrible piece of policy. In 1998, the Copyright Office, the Clinton administration, they were all warned about it. It's not a surprise. This was a totally foreseeable outcome. If you read Pam Samuelson writing about this in 1988, she absolutely predicted it. Now, every 3 years, the Copyright Office holds these triennial hearings where they hear petitions for use exceptions. So that is to say, an exception that allows you to make a circumvention, but not to avail yourself of a tool to make this. This is a completely ornamental thing. So it's like, you are allowed to jailbreak your iPhone, but you are allowed to jailbreak your iPhone. No one's allowed to give you a tool to jailbreak your iPhone. You are allowed to, you individually, identify a defect in the bootloader for your iPhone, write an entirely new stack that exploits that defect, creates a new firmware, and loads your iPhone, but you can't tell anyone else how you did it. So these are really, like, the fact that these are even held is just a horrible joke, right? But the US Copyright Office diligently holds these every 3 years, and if nothing else, when they grant these use exceptions, it's a way to get into the record that the federal government thinks that the DMCA is blocking someone from doing something legitimate, even if it doesn't really allow them to do it. And so when you go to these 1201 hearings, and when you read the docket, it's full of people like the Surfriders Foundation, who are an anti-ocean plastics group, saying, like, the 1201 interferes with phone repair because they do parts pairing on every part in the phone. And so people just throw their phones away, and a significant fraction of the plastic that we throw away ends up in the ocean, right? And so you do see these people coming forward. One of the things that's happened with right to repair is, you eat an elephant one bite at a time. We're picking off right to repair one sector at a time. So you have automotive, because it's a nation of gearheads, and Americans will get angry if you tell them you can't fix their cars. In Colorado, we got wheelchairs, because powered wheelchairs are dominated by 2 private equity companies. They are screwed up because most of them are paid for through Medicare, and so you have like a single buyer that's kind of an absentee advocate for people who use them. And there is parts pairing and digital locks in them that interferes with their repair, even down to, like, if you change the tire pressure in your wheelchair and you want to adjust the torque so that to make up for the new steering characteristics of the chair, you have to wait for a technician to come and do it. And if you're someone whose mobility is very limited, like you can't get out of bed without your chair, when your chair breaks and you have to wait 2 weeks for the person to come out, that is 2 weeks in which you literally can't leave your bed, right? Like, it's really bad. So Jared Polis signed a wheelchair right to repair bill 2 years ago in Colorado, and that's now model legislation. It's being floated in a lot of other state houses. And so you see these coalitions bubbling up. And behind the scenes, it's a lot of the same actors, right? Like it's us at EFF, it's the Repair Coalition, it's a bunch of other groups there's a group called Secure Repairs that exists solely to rebut the nonsense that if you allow people to fix their stuff, they will open themselves up to information security defects that are so grave that they'll eventually die. Like, if you saw on question 1 here, the automotive right to repair, there were these scare ads where it was just like a woman being followed home by someone who read the telemetry out of her car because there was automotive right to repair, and then murdered her, right? It was literally like, independent mechanics will lead to your demise. Which, like, if that's true, have you considered making cars store less of our personal data? Like, that seems like a pretty good answer, right?
Privacy first again.
Yeah. So, you know, there's a lot of this going on. So I think that there is a ton of that coalition work. And certainly there's just like the rise and rise of the labor movement broadly is producing dividends everywhere. And the rise and rise of the labor movement is co-occurring with the rise and rise of labor protections. So under Biden, we have Jennifer Abruzzo, the General Counsel of NLRB, who's brought down some pretty cool muscular rules, right? She's won a couple of court victories on them. So one is a rule that says that if the employer interferes with the union election in a way that could plausibly alter the outcome of the election is canceled and the union is immediately recognized. So this is like a tilt sensor for the union election, right? If the boss shakes the pinball machine, game over for them. And then the other, so the NLRB is enjoined, I think through the Taft-Hartley Act, they're enjoined from imposing a contract on an employer that won't bargain for a contract. It's one of the things that's in the PRO Act is the right to have a mediator impose a contract. So Jennifer Abruzzo cannot impose a contract, but what she said was, and this, I think this had to do with Starbucks, where she said, okay, if a year has gone by and you don't have your first contract, I can't make you have a contract, but what I will make you do is honor the terms of a contract in a comparable firm that has given their workers a contract until such time as you have a contract. And again, it was upheld I think by an administrative law judge, so that we might get into some LOPR problems. But LOPR only affects, as I understand it, I'm not a lawyer, only affects regulation and not conduct remedies. So if she's moving in and saying to a specific firm as a conduct remedy after you're adjudicated to have violated the National Labor Relations Act, this is your remedy, LOPR Bright doesn't touch it. It's just about regulation. So I think that it's more onesie-twosie because she has to bring a case against every employer that does this. But when we're talking about big employers like Starbucks, that's a lot. And I think that redounds to the benefit of tech workers who struggle with employers who won't give them a contract, employers who interfere with their union votes, and so on. So the victories won by Starbucks workers are victories that can be leveraged by tech workers. And so that's great. And then you asked about interoperability, distributed ledgers, and so on. I am a giant crypto skeptic. I am someone who makes hardcore like Bitcoin maxis look like no coiners. Like I'm the world's most no coiner. There's a lot. It's a complex reason. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with distributed ledgers, and we're short on time. But the short but dense answer is that you can build a permissioned blockchain, which is to say a distributed ledger where, say, there's 15 or even 150 mutually untrusting parties who are all running a mirror of the ledger. This is how your browser does certificate transparency, for example. So your browser, every time you get a secure certificate, was part of a TLS connection. It's doing this operation. There's, I think, 18 of these servers that it's contacting. They're in different countries. The people who operate them don't necessarily like each other or trust each other. But because of the magic of Merkle trees and all of this good stuff, they can tell that no one else has altered the ledger, right? And you can do that, and you can get 99.9% of the trustlessness that you get from a fully distributed ledger, except it costs as much to run as a couple of light bulbs instead of like a whole Amazon forest, and you don't need a speculative economy to power it. You don't need like a casino underneath it to run it. And moreover, when you actually look at what comes out of the other end of a DAO, as soon as a DAO wants to do a thing that isn't purely financial, all the trustlessness collapses, right? So we build this DAO. We burn 5 Amazon rainforests to make it run, and we decide that we're going to buy the US Constitution. We raise $20 million, and then we just hand it to a guy. And we say, go to Sotheby's and buy us the Constitution. Well, the thing is, if we trust that guy to have the $20 million, why don't we just trust him to like run a WordPress blog where we argue about this stuff? Like, what additional security have we gotten against a central authority thwarting our will as a group when at the end of the procedure, right, if we're doing anything other than financial derivatives or essentially casino stuff, you still have to like give the money to a guy. If you're going to trust that guy, what did you burn down the rainforest for? And so the kind of the short but dense answer, and I recognize there's a lot of jargon in there, but the short but dense answer is, on the one hand, I think you get most of the benefits without going to a fully distributed trustless architecture. And on the other hand, I think the fully distributed trustless architecture is not actually present in nearly every instance, and the instances in which it is are the instances I'm least interested in, because they tend to be purely financial and they tend to be financialized. They tend to be kind of nonsensical Wall Street casino stuff and not things that impact the real economy, by definition.
Excellent, thank you. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but everyone, if you have any questions, please come by the book signing table, and please join me in thanking Cory for a great talk today.